right, so good morning, good afternoon. We've got folks joining us from all across Canada and the US today, and a welcome into another exciting Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants program. So my name is Jesse. I'm going to be the host for today, and if you are new to us, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world, and that is just our standard programming. This today, right in the midst of our Oceans Week, is our only non-oceans presentation and marks a very, very exciting culmination of an epic series in conjunction with Parks Canada. So all year long, we have been partnering with the mountain parks, those incredible places in British Columbia and Alberta where millions of people go every year to really bask in nature and learn about the incredible natural world we have on the western side of our beautiful country. So do check out the Peak Discovery series below if you want to see all those programs. We've paddled down rivers, we've done snow things, we've done bison and bears and fish and more. It's been a really, really exciting time. And it's sort of a bittersweet day that we wrap it up today with our Pine in Decline event. Now, before we dive in with the program, this is all about trees today. We are excited to dive in with a pretty unique story, something we've never quite done before at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. But I want to begin with a picture for you all. So if you're joining on YouTube, let us know where you're joining from. If you're live with us in StreamYard, welcome in. And we're going to start with this picture. These are some pretty unusual trees, most of which are real, one of which is quite fictional, but very fun, that's the same. And I'm curious which one of these is your favorite. Now, I must say, of these five, and we've got here listed our Joshua tree, our coconut palm, a dragon tree, a truffula tree from Dr. Seuss, and a WBP tree. My favorite is the dragon tree, the top right there. This has always been one of my very favorite plants in the entire world. It looks fictional, it looks fake, but it's totally real. You can find them in some of the most special parts of our planet. And so if you guys have a favorite tree, either tell your teacher, let us know, put it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you guys. Maybe in lieu of you guys answering, I'm going to assume that you all agree with me and that number 3 is the best. But what we're going to do in a minute is turn it over to Natalie at Parks Canada in the Kootenay National Park to tell us a little bit more about herself and some of the cool stuff they're doing there. And so, without further ado, Natalie, welcome to the broadcast and take us away.
Good morning, Jesse. Good morning to everybody. Welcome. I'm here in Kootenay National Park, right on the park boundary. And my name is Natalie Stoffel. I'm the fire vegetation ecologist in Mount Revelstoke and Glacier, but we have way too much snow in our mountains to be broadcasting from there. So I'm very fortunate to be here in the beautiful Columbia Valley. So thanks for joining us. Today I'll be telling you about 2 of my favorite trees. So if you looked at that photo and you commented on your favorite tree, mine would be in the bottom far right because it's the whitebark and limber pine trees. They're both 5-needle pine trees and they're really fantastic.
2 for 1, like you get to pick 2 favorite trees. That's pretty cool. So tell us a little bit more about them.
I know I have a hard time just choosing one. But I will tell you, so if you look at the needles here, it's hard to tell from further away. But if you're out hiking in the forest and you see a pine tree, it's worth looking at the needles because every pine tree has a different number of needles per bundle. And the 5-needle pines are special because, as we just mentioned, there's 5 needles per bundle. So that includes whitebark, limber, and even western white pine, which grows at lower elevations. So here we are in the mountains with limber pine right next to us, and whitebark grows a little bit higher up, and it's probably under snow right now, which is why we're down here. But there are some really cool trees, and like the Lorax that you've been reading about the truffula trees, these trees do some pretty cool things. So in the springtime when there's a bunch of snow, the canopy of these trees helps the snowpack stay and the soil stabilize. So instead of the slopes eroding, so think of high alpine where it's just rocks and there's not a whole lot of vegetation, these trees will stabilize the slopes, keep the snow melting slowly, and prevent a lot of flooding downstream. Another really cool thing about these trees is the pine nuts that the trees produce. So if you think about a pine cone, I'll pull one up for you. These trees produce a lot of food. So I'll put it up to the camera. This is a limber pine cone. And inside, there's some really neat pine nuts. Like if you've ever eaten hummus, it's usually made with pine nuts, which is a really fatty seed from some European pine trees. And these ones are natural and native to North America. And they feed squirrels, grizzly bears, and Clark's nutcrackers, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So do you hear that in the tree? Can you hear? I can't hear it. So that is the sound of a Clark's nutcracker. I'll show you a prop because we can't steal real birds. So Clark's nutcrackers are in the Steller's jay family, and they have black and white plumage, and they have a really neat relationship to these trees. Does anyone here know what a mutual relationship is?
Ooh, okay. So YouTube classes. I'll give you guys a second. StreamYard classes. We've got 3 live groups. Does anyone know what a mutual relationship is? Miss Fonseca's class. You guys, mic is on. Does anyone know? Want to take a stab at a mutual relationship? What do we think?
Can you hear us? Yes.
One student in the back.
It's like if there's two things, they're like the same thing to each other.
Yeah.
Like a mutual friendship.
Like a mutual friendship, like working together, connecting. That's a great answer, man. And way to go for being bold enough to answer that live in the program. I appreciate it. Any of our YouTube classes want to take a stab? That was actually a really good answer. So Natalie, if you want to keep going on, I think that was actually pretty solid.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Just like two best friends that need each other. Mutual relationships are between two different species. So the Clark's Nutcracker, and in this case, the limber pine or the whitebark pine. So limber pine cones do open on their own, but let me show you a whitebark pine. Whitebark pine seeds have a fancy term called I'm not even going to say it. They don't open. See this? They're armored. So these ones actually require the birds to open the seeds for them. And I'm going to show you a pine nut. This is a pine cone that the birds have eaten. So you can see where all the seeds come from. So this bird uses its extra strong beak to open up the cone. And without these birds, the whitebark pine tree wouldn't be able to disperse its seeds. They don't open in fire, they don't open on their own. So they require these birds to disperse their seeds and reproduce. So that's what's called a mutual relationship. The bird benefits because it gets some really high value, nutritious seeds that it caches throughout the mountains and it can eat later to feed its young and its partners. And the whitebark pine benefits because the seeds get dispersed throughout the landscape. I'll put it back. All right. So these trees are in trouble. They're really beautiful trees. They're iconic to our mountain landscapes, but they do experience a certain number of threats. So there's an introduced disease from Europe and Asia called white pine blister rust, and I'm going to show that to you in the tree right behind me. It was brought over on a shipment of seedlings unintentionally in 1906 into Vancouver. So here on your slide, you can actually see a picture of active blister rust. If you were to touch that blister, it'd be kind of like the cheese powder in Annie's mac and cheese or Kraft dinner, if you've ever had that. It's kind of this really orangey powder when you touch those blisters. So that photo is a picture of active blister rust. And it comes in and it affects the tree through the needles and then gets to the main bole of the pine tree, so the bark. And then I'm going to show you an example of an inactive canker right behind you. I don't know if you can see this over here. But this tree here, you can see how there's sap flowing here. And then there's some dead needles. See how this is red and dead? So the blister rust came in through the needles, made its way down to the main stem of the tree, where it's now trying to kick it out through sap. But you can see the whole top of this tree is dead. And why that's important is because the top of the tree is where the pine cones are produced. So without those pine cones, there's no way for it to reproduce, and then there'll be less trees in the future. So again, you can kind of see roughened bark, a dead top, and some red needles here. And those are all signs that we look for in blister rust. There's some other threats to these beautiful trees as well. Just give you a second to move around here. So a second threat to whitebark pine and limber pine is something called the pine beetle. So don't be scared about this. This won't give you nightmares. This is 20 times the size. The actual beetles aren't this big. This is just a big model, so you can see what it looks like. So these beetles burrow into the bark. It's a native beetle to North America, but it's expanding its range. Due to climate change and warmer temperatures, the beetle is moving up into the mountains and further north as well. The actual size of the beetle is itty bitty tiny. It's in this vial. It's kind of hard to see. So you don't have to have nightmares because it's not going to eat you, but it does affect the trees. And once the beetles burrow into the bark, it can kill the trees within 1 to 2 years. So this is another threat to pine trees. A third threat to the pine trees is how we have chosen to manage fire in the past. Historically, as soon as there was a fire, we try and put it out. And we got really good at suppressing fire on the landscape, to the point where there is very little area burnt in parts of our parks that really need fire reset the ecosystems. And these pine trees are early successional species, which means that they establish in big open landscapes. So you can kind of see there's not a ton of dense forest right behind me. They love these open landscapes where the Clark's nutcrackers can bury their seeds and go and find them again. In big dense forests, these trees have a hard time competing. They need a lot of light, they need a lot of space, and fire does a really good job of opening up that space and encouraging the Clark's nutcracker to cache there. A fourth threat to whitebark and limber pine is climate change. And as I mentioned earlier, it's encouraging beetles to go further north. It can be causing some drought stress for some of these trees, and it can also influence the type of fire behavior that we're seeing. So we might be seeing bigger and hotter fires than we've ever seen before, not just because of the fire suppression, but because of the actual climate that we experience today.
So this is a lot of threats. We've got like the mountain rust, we've got the beetle, the giant beetle that will haunt my nightmares. Your insistence that it wasn't going to eat me actually made me feel like it's more likely to happen just incidentally. We've got fire suppression, we've got climate change. Like, what's being done to help with this? This is quite the list of threats.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. So that's why we're here. We're here to be friends to these trees and help them persist on the landscape. So without support, these trees are endangered and they're threatened. And so we're trying to do our best to help these trees. So what we do is we do light some prescribed fires to open up some areas for planting and to encourage Clark's nutcrackers to bury their seeds. So we'll be influencing the landscape that way. We also look for healthy trees in really sick stands. And the reason we do that is because those special trees have traits that could be resistant to the blister rust. So about 1% of trees in North America are resistant to blister rust. And so we're trying to find those trees and get the seeds and plant them out on the landscape. So I have a colleague here that's in the tree, Louise. If you can just point the camera up. He's in the top of the tree. So what we do here in Parks Canada is that we climb these trees to get the cones. The cones live at the very tops of the trees, which is why Louise is so high in the tree. Do you guys like climbing trees?
I love climbing trees personally. My actual philosophy as a child was every time I saw a tree, I thought, is that a good climbing tree? And if I could, I'd go up it. Maybe not the safest option, but if you guys do like climbing trees, let us know in the chat or just tell yourselves. It's a great opportunity. Not often do we have people in trees in a program though. It's about the 5th time it's ever happened in 2,500 broadcasts. So thank you for that, Natalie.
Oh, it's so much fun. And Louise is having a blast in the trees. Got a good view out there. But we're so lucky because for our jobs, we actually do climb trees. When I was a kid, I would climb trees for fun all the time. And now I get to do it for work. So I feel really lucky to do that. But it's not just for fun. We're doing it to help save the trees. So you can see that Louise is near the very top of that tree. And he's putting these little things. I don't know if you can see them, but they're these little mesh cones that are on top of the branches. There he is holding one. And he puts them over the branch tips where the cones are. And that's to keep the cones inside of the bags. Does anyone have any ideas why we might bag the cones like that?
Ooh, I don't even know off the top of my head. Let's see, Meadow Ridge, you guys have some hands up. What do we think? We're bagging the cone.
Yeah, I can see some hands up. Go for it.
So say what your answer is.
So it keeps the cones safe.
Keeps the cones
Yeah,
safe.
you're so right. You're so right. What do you think it's trying to get at the cones?
Yeah.
It's trying to. Hey guys, it's trying. Can you say that again?
Yeah.
What do you think is trying to get at the cones? What are we trying to keep the cones safe from?
Nice.
The nutcrackers.
You're right. Yeah, it's the nutcrackers. So that's perfect. The nutcrackers do try and get the cones, which is great. And normally we want them to get the cones. But when we're trying to collect seed from these really important resistant trees, if we didn't put cages around them, the nutcrackers would eat them. And then we wouldn't have any to grow. So the reason we're putting these cages on is so that we can go back and climb the trees again. So not only do I get to climb the trees in July and August, I get to go back in September and harvest those cones. So once the cones are ripe, just kind of like a nice ripe apple, that's when we climb the trees a second time, take off those cages, and collect the cones. So it's a pretty fun process, and it really does contribute to conservation. So it's a very privileged position that we have to be able to do something so fun like climb trees and have it make a difference for the trees. So when we end up at the end of the day, we end up with these pine cones. So Luis would have come down, and this will be September because it takes all summer for the the seeds to ripen, we end up with these pine cones. And then I think you've got a little video of what we do with them.
Oh.
Do you want to show that one, Jesse?
I don't have the video as we did the clip without the video for this one because we had the guy up the tree. So unfortunately, I don't have that PowerPoint, but I can get that to our classes later. We have a little video. We can share that with all our registered groups after the fact.
That's okay. I can just describe it for you. So you remember how earlier I showed you this pine cone that's been eaten by the nutcracker? So what we do is once we come down from the tree with the ripe cones in September, we take these cones and we open them up just like the Clark's nutcracker did. And we end up with all of these seeds. Does anyone have any idea what we do with the seeds once we open them up?
Ooh, what do we think? I know Mr. Ahmad's class is in too. If you guys want to chime in, please you just let us know in the chat. But Miss Fonseca's group, what do we do with the seeds once we've got them?
Favorite.
Plant them.
Plant them? That's a pretty good guess. I think that's pretty solid. Meadow Ridge, you guys, any different thoughts? Anything that we do with the seeds? Do you want to unmute?
Nathan.
Plant. Okay, so plant. Universal answer. Universal on YouTube too. Natalie.
Well, you're right. We do plant them. But to give them a better chance of survival, what we do is we actually take the seeds and we send them to nurseries to grow. So that way they have the ideal growing conditions and we can get seedlings in 1 to 2 years. Okay, here's a photo of us taking, here's a photo of the nursery with the little seedlings. So it takes 1 to 2 years for the seeds that we harvest to grow into these little seedlings. And then you're right, we do plant them out. And these trees, a subset of them actually go for resistance testing. So remember how I said we look for those really healthy trees in a stand with other trees that are very, very sick? So they actually go for testing to see if we're right and if they are part of that small percentage of trees that are resistant to blister rust. And what we're doing is when we get all these seedlings, we hike into the mountains or we fly into the mountains and we plant them in those big open areas. So maybe we did a prescribed fire and now we go back and we plant the seedlings there. And this just helps get those resistant genes, so those trees that are really, really important and have that natural resistance to blister rust, it helps get them on the landscape. And then they'll be putting out pollen, they'll be putting out cones and helping the other trees in the area fight that invasive disease. So it's a really neat thing. Another thing that we do to protect the trees is put pheromone patches. So remember that big old beetle I showed you earlier? There's actually something we can do about that too. So I'll come over here. I'm going to put on gloves because the pheromones are a little bit stinky and I don't like getting that smell on my hands. But what the pheromone pouches do is it's a scent that the beetles produce and we're mimicking. So we take this little white pouch, here I'll show you the camera, the little white pouch that has pheromones in it. And pheromones is just a fancy term for things that smell. So beetles produce these pheromones. And when they're producing these pheromones, it's telling the tree that the beetles are already in this tree. So we're essentially tricking the beetles to tell them not to attack this tree because there's already too many beetles there. It's like the hotel's full, you can't check in, go check out something else. So we protect this really important trees, and these are the trees that we're gonna climb. We can't protect all of the trees in the forest, but we do protect those really healthy trees in the sick stands. And so that's how we prevent the beetle from getting them. We also sometimes do a little bit of clearing around the trees. So remember how I talked about fire and how it can be really helpful? We also don't want that fire to burn down those really, really healthy trees that we talked about. So sometimes we clear a little bit of area around the trees so if a wildfire does come in, it doesn't burn those important trees. So those are some of the things that we do. Does anyone know how long it takes for whitebark pine to produce cones?
Okay, we'll bring up our options for folks, okay? So 3 to 5 years, 10 to 20 years, or 30 to 70 years. What do we think? In the chat, if you guys want to put anything there, feel free, both YouTube and StreamYard. I know Meadow Ridge, you guys need to go in a minute, so feel free to start sharing questions in the chat as well. But what do we think? I mean, instinctually, my mind would go to 10 to 20. Seems reasonable. It's like when, as humans, we sort of branch off into the world ourselves, so maybe it's similar for the trees. But what do we think? C is our options, C and B. So we've got no one thinks 3 to 5. We've got some people think 30 to 70 or 10 to 20. What is it, Natalie? I'm so curious.
That's right. Those are all really good guesses. The thing about whitebark pine is it takes a long time to produce seeds. So remember how I said it takes 1 to 2 years to grow in the nursery before we hike them out into the forest and plant them in open burns? Well, to produce seeds, those trees are going to take another 30 to 70 years to produce cones. So similar to like how Luis is in this tree here, we need to find those older trees to collect cones from. And so what does that mean? That means that trees take a lot of time. So within my career, those little seedlings that I plant, I'll be very lucky if I'm hiking up to those sites in 70 years. In fact, it's probably fairly unlikely, but you might be able to see them. So what we're doing is we're planting resilient forests for the future. So we're getting those genetics out on the landscape, giving the trees a good chance of surviving and helping them combat that introduced blister rust that I talked about earlier. But this is all going to pay off down the road. The goal of this program is to really get those healthy forests in 80 to 100 years that the Clark's Nutcrackers can then take over again, and they'll be able to visit those trees, put the seeds underneath their tongue, fly out into the forest, find some really cool open areas, and do our jobs for us. So at that point, we're hoping that those trees and the whole ecosystem will be rebalanced. So in the meantime, we're just giving the trees a hand. We're here to help. Parks Canada takes species conservation seriously. We're really lucky to work in these beautiful mountain parks. And we're just trying to give the trees a hand up until that they can take care of themselves with their best friend, the Clark's Nutcracker. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, sorry, the button to bring me back just didn't work for a second there. Well, first and foremost, Natalie, thank you so much for sharing this. It's so awesome to have the chance to hear from you guys live in the mountains with Luis up the tree. How cool is that? And some great interaction today. I do want to bring up ever so briefly for our students, just to make sure this exists in the program. Anyone can watch this YouTube later, but here are some amazing things that you guys can do to keep the learning going. A whole whitebark pine page of Parks Canada, some other great options and opportunities to keep the learning going, get excited, and sort of fall in love with these ecosystems the way that Natalie and I certainly have. But let's dive in with questions, folks. If you're on YouTube, you want to share in the chat, please do. We'd love to hear from you over the next 15, 20 minutes. But what we'll do to begin is go to Miss Fonseca's class, to Mr. Ahmed. We'll come to you in a second. Miss Fonseca, come on in and kick us off if you have a question for Natalie. Hey, guys.
If you guys have a question, put your hand up and then really loud so they can hear. Mahi.
How many seeds come in each cone?
Yeah, how many seeds are we shown? Perfect.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking that. It really depends on the side of the cone, but usually we can get about 50 to 80 seeds per cone. So in a big, large, mature whitebark pine cone, that's how much we can expect. And a really cool thing that we do is if we're not sure if they're ripe enough, we actually x-ray them, which is so cool because then what you see is an x-ray of the seed and you can see if it has the ability to germinate. So that's really neat. So we take those 50 seeds from that tree, x-ray a subset and be like, okay, this is a really good batch. And if they're not ripe, then we'll focus on planting the other ones so that we don't take up space that we don't need in a nursery.
Amazing. What cool science is that? I love it. Thank you, Natalie. Great questions coming in on YouTube to kick us off. Okay, so Laura wants to know, and this is a question that requires a little bit of background explanation. How do we know the trees are resistant and not just communicating through roots and fungi to protect themselves? So just as a bit of a backdrop, this is actually quite advanced knowledge for botany, but we now know that a lot of trees do communicate with one another and can help sort of mitigate threats as a community in a forest. So how do we know they're not doing that versus just resistant to the fungi? Very cool question.
I love that question. That's so cool. And we actually do study that fungi. It's called mycorrhiza. It's a really neat relationship that it has with the tree. And it does, you're right. It gives them nutrients. It gives them a little bit of extra, what you could call an immune system for a tree. It really does help them out. So we do study those fungal relationships with the whitebark pine. And you're right, we don't exactly know 100% when we choose those trees to climb that they are resistant. So essentially we're taking an educated guess. When we go out in the forest and say there's 100 whitebark pine trees there and we find 2 that look healthy and everything else is sick, those trees are the ones that we're betting are resistant. But we don't just assume that. So what we do is we climb it like Louise is, get the cones, and then we, like I said earlier, we send them to resistance testing. So that those little seedlings will get inoculated. So essentially they get intentionally infected with blister rust. So we take those healthy trees that we think are resistant, infect them with blister rust and see what they do. Some of them will actually get the infection, and some of them will actually be really healthy. So we're testing that theory in the field. So that's a really good question. Thank you for asking.
It is, and I want to note for our class as students, if you guys can find something in your life that you are half as passionate about as Natalie is about all this, you are good to go. You're honestly, the enthusiasm is so palpable. I love it. Mr. Ahmad, come on in, and if you have a question for us, welcome in. Hi. Yep, you're good. You're in the broadcast.
Okay, question would be, so how large would the tree canopy have to become in order for the projected effects of climate change to be successfully mitigated within the time frame of the coning maturation, 70 years?
Cool.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Climate change is a really tricky thing to handle. We're very aware of it, and individually we can't each make the climate change. We don't have that power, but collectively as a whole, we can make decisions that can help with that, mitigate that threat. In terms of timescales, the biggest thing that we can do is helping the tree become more resilient itself. So since that blister rust is non-native, combating that is kind of our first method of defense. We might not be able to change the climate in this moment, but if we give the trees the best chance, they are very hardy and they can survive a lot of really tricky situations. So that's kind of our strategy, is just doing the best that we can to help the tree survive and be resilient on its own.
Fantastic. We've gotten some pretty hardcore questions to kick us off now, Lisa. We'll take an easy one. Is the Nutcracker endangered? Cheyenne wants to know, like specifically endangered, vulnerable, threatened. Where is that at on the red list?
That's a really good question. The Nutcracker is not listed. So whitebark pine is listed federally as endangered, and limber pine is recommended to be listed. It's not listed yet, but it's recommended to be. Clark's Nutcracker is not listed. But the thing is, if limber and whitebark pine disappear from the landscape, we would start to worry about nutcrackers at that point. So right now it's doing pretty well, but it's something that we're keeping track of and we're aware of. It does have the ability to eat other seeds. So Douglas fir, we have a Douglas fir tree right behind me as well. It can eat some of those seeds, but they're not nearly as nutritious and they don't have the same reproductive value as the whitebark and limber pine cones. So right now the Clark's Nutcrackers are doing okay, but if the forests disappear, that might change. So we're keeping an eye on it for sure.
And I think this is a really important thing. So much of conservation is, oh, something's endangered. Let's do like an ICU thing and save it from the brink. And that is an effective strategy. That's been something that we've done for many, many years now. But it's really important to make sure the ecosystems are intact to begin with so that we don't have to save something when there's only a few of them left. So I'm really glad we're doing this work and highlighting that in today's program. So Ms. Wilson's class has a ton of questions. Ava wants to know how the bird opens the cone. So like, what is it actually doing? Is it ripping them apart? Is it sort of fitting its bill in between? What's going on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me grab my model again. So the Clark's Nutcracker, along with a lot of jays, have really, really strong beaks. So this is just a model, but you can see how it has this long pointy beak, and it's very, very strong. It's almost like pliers. So it takes its beak and opens, like physically opens the cone. And then here in this model, it has a little seed in its mouth. It has a sublingual, which means under the tongue pouch. And it stores the seeds there until it can fly around and cache them in those big open burns that I was talking about. So that's how it opens the seeds or the cones. It's really cool.
How cool is that? Yeah. We got a question. I love this. So if trees have blister rust, is there a way to save them? Can you heal them, or are they done for the count? Like, is there no way to rescue them once they have that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Some trees will get infected and then like an immune response, like when you get a cold and you get better, some trees can heal over and fight off the infection. But because blister rust isn't native to North America, a lot of our trees can't do that. They just have never been, they haven't evolved with that disease. So most of them will eventually die, like the tops will die first and then the tree will die. But some of them will be able to fight that infection. And so by selecting the cones from those healthy trees, the resistant trees, and planting them out, we're helping them kind of change the tide and get more immunity, if you will, to the blister rust.
Such a cool response. One other thing, because this is World Oceans Week, we've got a bunch of other ocean programs. A very close parallel to this. The only other one I've ever heard is for coral. They're breeding coral that is more resistant to heat and temperature shocks and extremes, allows them to hopefully survive. So I think it's really neat that we're doing that in forests as well in the mountains. Ms. Fonseca's class, go ahead, Natalie.
I just want to mention that this has been done before. So we're not totally out on a limb here. That's a bad thing. This has been done with a different species, Western white pine. So that's a commercial species that's found at lower elevations that people harvest for timber value. But it's also susceptible to this disease. But back in the 1960s, they started breeding that tree, and right now it's doing great. So Western white pine, there's a lot of genetically resistant trees out there, and they're able to continue using it as a timber resource. We're only starting that on these trees because they need our help. So they're not timber species. We don't cut them down, but they're really, really important, like I mentioned at the start of this program, for the ecosystem, for the birds, for the bears, and for the soil stabilization and snowpack. So we're doing that same process that's been tried and true, and it's actually tested and working in a different species. We're applying those methods to these really, really special, cool trees.
Very neat. Natalie, this is like the fastest Q&A of all time. We're going to head back to our live classes for another one from each. Miss Fonseca's group, share your first one first, and then we'll go to Mr. Ahmed in a second. Hey, guys.
Do you want to ask your question, Tammy, or?
Okay. How many trees have been planted by hand or machine in total in Kootenai National Park?
Yeah.
Well, that's a really good question. I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many have been planted in Kootenai National Park, but we're increasing those numbers every year. So I think by the end of this year, we'll have over 10,000 trees planted within Parks Canada.
Wow.
And so every year we're increasing. So as we climb trees and we get cones, we get more and more seeds that we're able to grow into seedlings and plant those out. So we're scaling it up for sure. But I can't give you an exact number right now, but we can get back to you with that for sure.
3, 4. It is hard when you're on that scale, but if you do get us that info, we'll make sure to pass it along to the classes. You guys have that exact figure. Mr. Ahmed, come on back in, and then Miss Fonseca, I know you have a second one, so I'll come back to you right next. Hey, welcome back in.
Okay, thank you so much. This is more of a practical question, a very practical question. So for people who live in big cities and they have trees as part of their front yard, backyard, my understanding is that...
Yo, you're flying with us. You're muted for your class. This always happens when people are on virtual calls. You're good.
Sorry. Okay, now I'm audible all around. Okay, so in big cities, many people have trees in the front lawn, back lawn, or in city parks. So my question is this: my understanding is that when people mow their lawns, sometimes they chip away at the bark surrounding the trunk of the tree, and that often leads to various types of infections for the tree that many people particularly who live in cities and who aren't botanists like yourselves, are unaware of. But it's this type of ordinary day-to-day behavior of manicuring lawns and cutting and doing lawn work around trees can have a negative impact on trees. So maybe you can just provide some perspective as to what people can do to ensure that their actions don't inadvertently harm trees within city spaces.
Oh, for sure. Trees in cities are so important because they provide us shade. They do that same effect where they'll kind of capture some of the rainfall and stop like the huge gunnels of water running through the streets. So city trees are really important, and you can protect them by trying to avoid damaging them directly. So what you mentioned was with the lawnmower. Same with these trees, we try and be really gentle around the tree. When we break branches or we accidentally rub the bark too much, you're right, it could be an area where infection can get in, not necessarily with blister rust, but with other diseases. And so just being aware of trees, being careful with them and treating them with respect, that's what you can do in your neighborhood. And I think that's a really good question. So thank you for asking.
Fantastic, guys. All right, Brooklyn in Miss Wilson's class is asking a ton on YouTube. So I'm going to head to her for a second. She wants to know, Luis is up in the tree. How does he climb the tree? Does he have special equipment? Is he just super limber? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you can see that we take tree climbing seriously. So Luis has a helmet on, he has gloves, he has eye protection so that he doesn't get branches and needles in his face. And we wear these special climbing harnesses that are arborist harnesses. So that's very similar to rock climbing, but just a little bit sturdier so that we can stay in the trees for a while. So we do have these special rope access systems, and we do specialized training so that we can access trees safely. So when I was a kid, I never used any ropes. I just climbed trees, kind of like you guys all do. But when we're doing it for work and we're in these high mountain places, we have to be really safe and careful, both so that we don't damage the trees, but also so that we stay safe and that we can protect the tree and continue to go up more trees in the future. So Luis has some really specialized gear that's very similar to rock climbing, but adapted for trees that protects the tree while he goes up there. That's a good question.
Not only is that a great answer, but I want to do a huge shout out to Louise for literally like pantomiming and showing every single thing as you were doing that. That was amazing. Miss Fonseca's class, way to go, guys. Yeah. Miss Fonseca's class, I know you had a second one. I'm going to come back to you. We're in our final few questions here. Time flies when we're having fun in these broadcasts, but come on back in, guys, and take us away.
Really, really loud, Kiara, so they can hear.
Is there a way to tell the difference between a fake pine beetle scent and a real one? If so, what is that?
A
Fake pine beetle scent and a real one.
Oh yeah, so that's great. So as a human, I wouldn't be able to tell if I smelled it. My nose isn't sensitive enough to really interpret what those pheromones or what those smells are. So it's a chemical that the beetles produce that beetles are really, really good about smelling and interpreting. So kind of like if your mom bakes some cookies or maybe your dad bakes some really good banana bread and you smell it wafting out of the oven, you want to run in and go grab some, right? So those beetles, they get the same signal. So they know that a tree is really good. Like it's a big tree, they want to attack it and eat they eat the inside of the bark there. Or if we put up these pheromones and confuse them, essentially we're just tricking them and we're saying like, nope, this isn't good. Maybe we put some spinach in your banana bread. You don't want to eat it, although I actually really like spinach. But anyways, it confuses the beetles so that they don't want to go attack that tree. So we're just tricking them. But yeah, my nose can't smell the difference.
See, the thing is, if you trick a tree, it can't trick you back, which is kind of fun. So that's just a lesson for all our kids out there. 2 more questions, guys. This has been so much fun. Let's take 2 from YouTube to wrap up. Paige wants to know if the trees need a lot of water. Do they grow in wetlands or are they just in the mountains there?
That's a really good question. These trees are actually very good at growing in really dry environments. So there's a lot of snow in the winter and it does melt off in the spring. But during the summer, where these trees grow, it's usually quite dry. So they're fairly drought tolerant up to a point. And they can handle a really hot and dry summer. You can kind of see the area that we're at. It's really rocky. There's a lot of stones here. There's not a lot of grass growing or vegetation. It's because we're in kind of that marginal dry habitat. So yeah, they're kind of a little bit dry, and that's what makes them competitive. So if you look downslope, I don't think you can see behind me, it's more thick forest grown in. A lot of other trees need more moisture and more nutrients to survive than these guys. These guys are really hardy. They can grow in really rocky, hard habitats.
Very, very cool. I love the camera work too. Thank you for that, Kelsey. All right, one final question. Conifers around our student have cones at all levels of the tree. Why do the whitebark pines only have them at the top? What's going on? Do we know?
That's a really good question. So I think it's probably having to do with attracting the birds. I'm not 100% sure about that, but a lot of trees will produce cones at their tips. So the whitebark pine grows very upright. Its branches kind of are like when you're stretching at yoga, its branches like to be up here. So a lot of cones are at the tips of those branches. There are a few branches down lower, but most of the cones will be found up top. So that's a good question. I don't 100% know the answer, but I think it has a lot to do with the growth form of the tree.
This has been such a fun Q&A. I know we could go all day, but I know our classes also have to head off the next period in a minute. So what I wanted to do is both mention that, again, this is the culmination of our Peak Discovery series. So a huge thank you to you guys in Kootenay, the entire Mountain Parks team for just an incredible few months of programs. You can check them all out there. And as Natalie showed as our sort of last slide in the program, if you want to learn more about the work that they're doing in the park, if you want to learn more about local trees, here are some great ideas and options to do so. Honestly, I think Natalie and I, we both agree that just getting out in nature is the best way to get started. Go explore, climb a tree if you can safely, but certainly go enjoy local forests. It's a great way to get excited about nature and learn more about what lives near you. So Natalie, what we do to end every broadcast, I know we've got a few people live with us here today, but we're going to bring everybody in to say a big thank you and farewell. So Mr. Ahmed and Ms. Fonseca's class, join me. Thank you so much for joining today. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and bye for now, guys.